The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Northeast Solar, homegrown in Hatfield, Massachusetts, and providing energy savings for their customers for over 10 years. Learn more at northeast-solar.com.
Welcome to the Fabulous 413. I'm Khalees Smith. Monty's off burning up at the beach, and we are getting ready for Juneteenth. We'll hear about a concert at Historic Deerfield celebrating the holiday with members of the participating ensemble. But first, a little history lesson about why we're celebrating. We're here for another The Power of History segment with Professor Dr. Ousmane Power-Greene of Clark University. And because the Juneteenth holiday is next week, we're going to dig in.
Let's get it.
Let's just get into, why Juneteenth had to happen.
Yeah. Well, there's the actual, I always think about it as the actual Juneteenth celebrations that took place June 19th, 1865, right, where you have this moment where eventually the Confederacy, which continued to fight despite Lee and others surrendering in April, word getting to Texas June 19th, 1865, and that being a time of celebration. And so, when you think about this federal holiday, for folk in Texas particularly, and all over the country too, this is a holiday they've been celebrating for a really long time.
Right.
So folks have been getting into it.
So at the core of it is that in Texas, there's a community of formerly enslaved folks that did not know that they were formerly enslaved. And the Union Army comes to town to just kind of rout out that last remainder of the Confederate Army that had been fighting out west and holding on to whatever fight they had left.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing you could think about emancipation as a process, right? And so when it comes to oftentimes people will talk about Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, which for all intents and purposes does not end slavery besides the places that are continuing to rebel, right? So it's a big deal. So that process, which actually even happens before then, but certainly by that moment until you have, this moment, which is acknowledged, June of 1865, places are continuing to find their way towards freedom. We'll see it that way. So, despite the General Gordon Granger, the Union general that shows up and announces the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. Despite that exciting news, African Americans, enslaved people, had been emancipating themselves, being involved in the war, doing what it takes to undermine the Confederacy throughout. And so I like to see it as a process, as opposed to a certain day where someone designates and says, you are now free.
Right. And speaking of that process, I feel like this holiday is also in key with Black Union troops moving west and gaining more independence with land. How does that ongoing emancipation process lead to more independence and incorporation of the Black community after it's put in place?
Well, this is actually crucial. I mean, one of the major points, for those of us who like history and study history, is we understand what happens afterward, which is, what people talk about as Reconstruction. Shout out to my advisor, Manisha Sina, who has an incredible book. Got to do the drops, my historians, a new book on Reconstruction. But, my point is that the process of actually, what does freedom mean, right? What does liberty mean, right? Granger says absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, right? In this proclamation, right, that is often acknowledged as Juneteenth. But, as you mentioned, I mean, being able to actually reconstruct a society, that, African Americans by and large were central to building, is going to be a process that's, some would argue, still going today in terms of Black land ownership.
Still going.
Still going. Others will very much detail the political efforts, the social efforts, and of course the economic efforts to actually establish a foothold in the South, and then of course the resistance to that. So all of this goes into play when we talk about it being a process and not necessarily a firm destination.
So So I'm going to mention a thing that my friend did, a terrible game, a terrible/awesome game that a friend of mine in their PhD program developed, which was 6 Degrees of the Failure of Reconstruction and tracing basically all of our modern problems back to the fact that Reconstruction ultimately fails. So, like, you end up with this interesting disconnect between like this wave of innovation of Black people getting elected, and then immediate. Well, not like immediate, because like there's that period of time where all of those things are happening, but like within a generation, there is backlash.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is stoppage to all of those efforts to kind of integrate basically America's newest citizens, even though they'd already been here.
That's right.
Let's get into that disconnect a little bit.
Well, I mean, I think that what you're touching on is one of the reasons why some people look at Juneteenth, perhaps as being similar to the Declaration of Independence and July 4th, right? Specifically because, what you have is you have a moment and the struggle will continue, right? So you have a moment of declaring something being the case, in this case, an ending to formalized state-sponsored slavery. But those who were in power, right, the enslavers, are also going to immediately begin a process of trying to reconstitute the power relationships, right? During the period which we call Reconstruction, they're engaged in a process of deconstruction simultaneously as people are trying to change things,
They're
right?
reconstructing something.
Exactly.
And I think perhaps they were more successful than the people trying to reconstruct the actual society. They were able in some ways to reconstruct those structures.
Well, and the question is, the classic work of the failure reconstruction, that framework where the effort to reconstitute the nation in ways, as you suggested, that take seriously the idea that all people have citizenship rights, all people should be able to vote, right? Black Americans, once an enslaved population, should have all those sort of human rights established in the Declaration of Independence. All of this was hotly contested, was something that those across the nation, not just the South, question whether or not we could bring African Americans into the body politic and actually function on equal foot, because we have a nation, not just a region, that believes in white supremacy, that white people are fundamentally better. They may not all agree that slavery is ethical, but they certainly, particularly places like Massachusetts, were not certain that Black people could actually be citizens and not wards of the state or something like that. And so, African Americans had, in that time period, worked tirelessly to demonstrate that, not only through their service, obviously, in the war, and then, of course, patrolling the South afterwards, but also, attempting to use the means in their hands to sometimes get back into the cotton economy. Of course, that wasn't ideal, but to get back involved in making something for themselves, and then by extension the nation. And so as you suggested, as you said, this process of undermining the efforts to actually create an equal society is something that is one of the sad tragedies of the era, as opposed to being some sort of like accidental, it's like, no, this is intentional. And in many ways, I think that, the president in 2021 having a federal holiday for Juneteenth, I think illustrates that effort to extend this process and to acknowledge this as a process, of course, coming on the heels of George Floyd and, of course, Black Lives Matter movement.
I'm curious about like some of the ways that the government tried in this time to level that playing field. It's not as if we weren't trying, however inadequately.
The forces that are aligned against you.
Right.
So it really speaks. All of the federal government's efforts to attempt to level the playing field were specifically and strategically attempted to undermine, by and large, right? Because we have to remember the goal on those who want, recently defeated, is to reconstitute the society with the same power relationships or as close as they could get. And so each effort was responded by some sort of counter effort to undermine those changes. And I'm not talking about like individual people, right? So, I mean, there are individual people who, go down and are involved with attempting to teach in freedom schools, people coming from New England, some white women coming from New England, particularly, black women coming from New England. It's not about the effort on those to actually attempt to offer education specifically as a means towards rights, right? Even land ownership, which can be taken away if you don't understand contracts and things. The problem is that you have a society that is trying to reconstitute itself and resist that. And this goes back to your point earlier, which is ultimately when you sort of think about the transformation, we think about by the 1890s, many of the efforts have been successfully undermined. And it's one of the reasons people talk about the sort of into Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, being a time period that's the lowest point in African American, the nadir, they say, the lowest point in African American life in the United States because of the successful, and usually using violence, the successes to undermine those efforts.
More on the multitude of Juneteenth celebrations in the U.S. and some of the fallouts from Reconstruction coming up next with Professor Ousmane Power-Greene of Clark University. You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
One of the things, vagrancy laws, for example, there was listening, where suddenly you're deemed a vagrant if you're not associated with a plantation or a job or whatever, snatched hold of thousands of children and young people, right? And they end up in these work camps that are already former plantations, and now they're laboring on these state contracts. And so, those that are not familiar with slavery by another name, it was a very prominent book, maybe back in, I think, the 90s, but I mean, the documentary was made, I recommend people check out because it really does talk about the sort of challenges after emancipation for African Americans to be able to survive and even thrive as citizens because the force against them were aligned as such.
We're talking with Dr. Ousmane Power-Greene about Juneteenth and some of the circumstances surrounding the holiday. Galveston can't be the only community where the Union Army has to come in and go, wait a minute, y'all are still working under these circumstances. That's not, we're going to put a stop to that. That's not okay. Are there other documented communities that the Union Army had to come in and kind of forcibly emancipate after the war?
In terms of documented examples, that's something definitely for historians who most historians. Let me put it this way: most historians write about the various ways emancipation manifests itself. So it's a very diverse group of ways, right? And so there is the sort of army rolling in. There is the sort of seeing Union troops and enslaved people self-emancipating, right? There's of course places that are held down in the South to some degree. You have those places after the Emancipation Proclamation could be read to, and so this goes back to that idea I was saying about it being a process because you're looking at a landscape. A landscape that's ravaged by the war in some cases and that has been, transformed in fundamental ways. And so really the process of celebrating and finding out that knowledge is one that continues. And then after the war ends, by and large, it's going to continue after that. And this is where we get all sorts of community celebrations of emancipation that stretch, from various dates, right, that people were using as a way to acknowledge it. I mean, some people January 1st in certain places, and in November. There's all sorts of rationale for these community celebrations. All of them seek to accomplish the same thing, and that is to acknowledge an ending of slavery and of people beginning to stride out anew.
How do Black communities above the Mason-Dixon line celebrate Juneteenth? Like, do they celebrate Juneteenth to begin with? Or, is it still more of those, smaller community celebrations whenever the community decides that it's the time?
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting, and I definitely wanted to bring this up because actually August 1st, or August, because of British emancipation, the Slavery Abolition Act in 1834, actually is like the earlier celebrations, particularly in northern communities, right? Where you have the anti-slavery fervor in the 1830s kicking off and there being celebrations for British emancipation as a means of saying, hey, look, this place that you guys rebelled against, saying Declaration, declaring your independence, et cetera, they've emancipated their enslaved people. What's going on here? And so the sort of tradition of celebrating emancipation, is these sort of August 1st celebration or Emancipation Days that, can be sometimes in August. And then, of course, that critique continues where someone like Douglas in the 1850s will use July 4th as a way to travel around and make proclamations both about, look what's that, the Caribbean, other places have ended, enslavement. It's time as an opportunity to sort of critique and also celebrate. But up until, when you think about the sort of, modern era up until now, a national holiday, these community festivals have various forms that are going to happen outside the South, whether it's the Northeast or the Midwest or whatever. They have various forms, but all of them are associated with this effort to connect emancipation with some sort of community celebration. So that's where you really see them. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to have a national holiday, right? Because when you have the federal government acknowledging it, it allows for, it sort of paves the way towards a sense of legitimacy around what had been going on a grassroots level, on a community level for over 100 years. And there's books that actually chart those community festivals because they all of them bring together early on, former people who were maybe enslaved or were free and fought in the Union Army. Those opportunities were there. We talked about Memorial Day and sort of, these different opportunities to celebrate this moment become really important throughout the nation. And it's just great to see that it's happening, in earnest now, even more so in places like Massachusetts.
Right. Talking with Dr. Ousmane Power-Greene about Juneteenth as we get ready for Juneteenth. But one last question, and
sure.
I'm sure at some point we're going to talk more about Reconstruction, but as the initial Reconstruction efforts started, was there actually, we've talked about some initiatives to try and get more equity into the Black community, but was there concerted effort to provide reparations for the Black community as part of Reconstruction? Yeah.
Well, when we think about this idea of how to repair, right, the sort of century plus reality of enslavement, and the ways in which this effort becomes tied together with the Civil War, the ending of the war, right? And so it depends how you frame it. In many ways, the ultimate effort by 40 acres and a mule, right? The sort of idea, Sherman's Field Order, doesn't take, right? And so you're not going to see, by and large, besides the South Carolina Land Commission, which attempts to sort of manifest it in some places like the Sea Islands and other places, you do get some land reform, as a mechanism. But ultimately, these efforts to repair in the Reconstruction era are really limited, right? And so efforts to redistribute land end up being more of a military thing and not a wide-scale process. Being able to get property rights and these sorts of things are a process that happens during Reconstruction, but there's quickly, let's say it like this, there's quickly a turn in sentiment, particularly in the North, right? By the 1870s, this sort of view that to make, good citizens, they have, quote unquote, formerly enslaved people have to figure out the same ways in which other people can save and be able to thrive in American society. And that sort of, misremembering, I like that term. Misremembering of the reality of enslavement seems to catch hold, and suddenly you have politicians and others who are in the North who are sort of making these claims around now the war's been over and, this group of people need to be able to be good citizens and stand on their own, almost completely discounting the many ways in which, mostly white settlers get land and resources to populate the Midwest and the West, almost forgetting about compensation for enslavers, right? They get compensated during various points. And so, all that goes out the window, and instead what we get is a quick move that takes place where suddenly the thought of attempting to repair the damage vis-a-vis land allotments pensions, cash, anything seemed to sort of go out of favor, unfortunately. And that's a part of this, broader movement, right? Is to bring together first of all, it's to acknowledge the reality of enslavement being central to the nation, and then to begin to say, like, okay, the nation, we had a war. After that, we have the passage of the 13th Amendment, slavery ends, and then acknowledging it through federal holidays. And then we get to, okay, so what are the connections between enslavement and then, of course, Black people's struggle for equality that continues. I think that we get to that conversation when we're first able to look enslavement in the face and celebrate emancipation, even if we still struggle with taking seriously scholarship on enslavement and what it actually meant. Completely disregarding any sense of history and instead attempting to, for all intents and purposes, distort what exactly that meant. And so we got to, all of this, I hope, for those who are celebrating Juneteenth, that it's an opportunity to do some of that work too. So we celebrate emancipation, but we're also acknowledging and thinking about the reality of enslavement and those ancestors who didn't have an opportunity to actually make it to that day, right? But are still very present.
Dr. Ousmane Power-Greene, the power of history, talking about Juneteenth. Thank you so much for joining us. And
yes, happy Juneteenth, everybody!
Happy Juneteenth, everybody! Up next, celebrating freedom for everyone with a concert at Historic Deerfield in honor of Juneteenth. You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by the UMass 5 College Credit Union, offering co-op advantage checking with cash back on all purchases, plus secure debit card controls, all from the UMass 5 mobile banking app. Insured by NCUA, umass5.coop.
Welcome back to the Fabulous 413. Historic Deerfield is bringing an all-star ensemble of early American musical performers to present a concert celebrating Juneteenth titled Jubilee, a Juneteenth concert of early American New England music featuring lively abolitionist psalmody, spirituals, dance tunes, and chamber music from the repertoire of regional African American composers and band leaders. The concert will take place on Thursday, June 20th at 7 p.m. at the Deerfield Community Center. And joining us are Tim Eriksen, musician in residence at Historic Deerfield and previous guest of the show, and Patrick Dailey, countertenor, archivist, voice faculty at Tennessee State University, who was recently named Best Classical Singer in Nashville Scenes Magazine of 2022, both of whom are part of this Juneteenth ensemble.
Very nice to be here.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Oh, of course. Tim Eriksen, I wasn't aware historic museums would get musicians in residence. What is it like being the musician in residence at Historic Deerfield?
It's a pretty new thing, and it's really great that Historic Deerfield has centered music, among other things, in an attempt to tell some new stories and present some new experiences for people. It's been really great helping out with that.
And this program is centering not just African-American composers and band leaders, but a local one at the heart of it. Can you talk about the composer from Greenfield that you'll have pieces from?
John Putnam is known as the father of contradance music. That's what it says even on his tombstone. And we'll be incorporating pieces from his repertoire. He was a very prominent band leader and violinist representing a much longer tradition of black fiddlers in New England. Even performed at Historic Deerfield in the 1890s in the very early planning days of the museum.
Who are some of the other composers that are going to be part of the program?
We will be performing some music by a man named Sawney Freeman from down in Connecticut. Some music from a newly discovered manuscript. I think this will be maybe the second time his music has been performed. It was published in 1805, but there was no known copy of the book that he published, but recently a manuscript containing some of his pieces was discovered in Hartford. And we'll also be doing some Handel, who's a better known composer, intersecting with this tradition in really interesting ways. And we don't exactly know 100% what we're doing. We're working it out as we go.
It's better to keep everybody on their toes and surprised. Patrick Dailey, your repertoire is so vast, but have you had the opportunity outside of spirituals to really work with compositions created by African American composers?
I have, in sort of more ways than one. Growing up in Nashville and going to school and such, undergrad and grad school and back and forth all over the place, I'm very adept, of course, with gospel music and jazz. And so those compositional things, when we think about commercial compositions of Black folks. But I'm the president of International Florence Price Festival. So I have a lot of experience with Florence Price's music, Margaret Bond's, championing the music of Black women composers, and also now getting into the work of early Black composers across the diaspora. Of course, who comes to mind is Ignacio Sancho. But there are a lot of different, people that we're kind of tapping into and engaging with in terms of performance practice for them and amplification of their music, getting more folks to perform this repertoire, to record it, because that's a great resource that's really needed. But also ensuring that sort of like even the low traditions, if you will, or folk traditions, and particularly in terms of Black sacred music, like the tradition of lining out hymns, or as the old folks would say down south in West Tennessee, where my folks are from, the Dr. Watts styles, right? That those are, in a sense, those are composition. They are not compositions in the Western sense of being scored, etc. However, there are also resources that do score them. That is a very important piece of this work. I do consider myself somewhat of a preservationist and someone who's ensuring that we are remembering, as a lot of the projects that I even create are around this concept of Sankofa, the West African concept of looking back to move forward. So
interesting that you say that, because I see the combination of like someone who's worked in spirituals quite a bit and someone who's working in shape note singing, and immediately see the correlation between those two. Was that a part of the basis of this concert, to try and bring those two traditions together in a way that was really synergistic?
It seems to be. It started with getting together a group of people, friends with intersecting interests. And I think one of the things we'll be doing is bringing together a story that is pretty new, considering that the music itself is all 18th and 19th century, but showing some real historical points of connection, but partly inventing it, partly discovering it. Of course, it's going to be focused on something that's musically exciting and meaningful, but also has these elements of narrative, these narrative through lines that show intersections that might be surprising. For example, the compositions of formerly enslaved Connecticut man in the early 19th century, and the music of George Friedrich Handel, which he was clearly very influenced by. Not your everyday narrative now, but is emerging as part of the story.
Historic Deerfield has done other Juneteenth events before. Why a concert for this year?
We did a concert 2 years ago that was led by Dr. Kathy Bullock and an ensemble who came up from Kentucky, and it was just wonderful. I think music is one of the best ways of engaging with history and culture and community. And John Davis, the director of Historic Deerfield, is himself a singer and very interested in music. So that was part of why they asked me a couple of years ago to come on board just informally a couple of times a year to help shape some presentations around music that intersected with the kinds of stories and histories that the museum is presenting, some of which are stories that hadn't been told before. Historic New England villages tend to be very focused on the European settler colonialist narratives, and there's been a real interest to expand that.
We are with Tim Eriksen and Patrick Dailey, both of whom are going to be a part of Historic Deerfield's Jubilee, a Juneteenth concert of early American New England music. Patrick Dailey, coming to Deerfield is a long trip for you. What is the appeal of coming here to do this work as opposed to doing it where you are?
That's a great question. And it kind of touches on something that Tim and I have talked about as well. I spent some time in the New England area going to graduate school. I went to Boston University. So I think what's important is to sort of ensure that the story and the narrative does not get locked down to certain spaces and certain regions. People tend to think about sort of the quote unquote Black struggle, the freedom fight, if you will, as being very much in the South. And we hear this narrative even through how we interpret the Negro spiritual, thinking about how, deep river, wanted to cross over in the campground. So the campground is the north, or follow the drinking gourd, let my people go, like all these sort of things kind of indicating high and upper, which we hear as heaven, but then we also interpret as the north. And to understand that it's more complex than just being, it's just being that, oh, I got to get north to get free and everything's going to be all roses and beauty and just life. No, I get north and I'm still going to struggle. The struggle just looks a little different. The fight looks a little different. The aggressions are a little different. It's important to recognize that the stain of enslavement is felt and reverberates, in a sense, all over the country, all over really the Western world. And I think we should grapple with that, and to recognize too that with all that has happened, with how painful it is, and there are things that we're still uncovering and things that we still may not even be able to face fully, right? That beauty can and has come from it. Great things have come from it. So we want to be in a New England town, a lovely, small and New England town, and kind of lay this at your feet. Everyone needs to take into account the humanity of this music, of these experiences, so that we can make our world better going forward. So I just feel like it's so important as a Southerner navigating various spaces is very interesting, because we have these narratives. On my late stepfather's side in Mississippi, they of course took that great migration through into Chicago, and things are supposed to be great for them, and then on other, for other families going into the Northeast. But we have to recognize that some folks had been there already. We want to make sure that a full breadth of story is being told. I personally take things from an Africana lens and hope to amplify ancestors whose names we'll never know and whose stories we'll never know, and make sure that they are resting well and uplifted on this side as they are on their other side. So that's the importance of the work.
When we start getting into especially like African American composers, when I think of early composers, I often end up thinking of more things along sacred lines, like masses, like often like psalm poems and things in that vein. And I'm curious as to if there is intentionally a balance in that in your program that you were looking to keep, or if that was even a concern of yours, having some things that were sacred and some things that were secular in this program.
I'm very interested, and I think all the performers are, in finding the places where there's a blurring between contemporary categories. The same people that were playing hard cider dances on a Saturday night might have been playing in church the next morning, hungover or not. There's intersection between, again, Handel and fiddle tunes and various choral traditions come together, and instrumental traditions, and the categories of, let's say, 1805, the time of Sonny Freeman's publication, were not necessarily the same categories that we have now. So it's really part of the joy of the process putting it together is looking for connections, intersections, just surprising musical things, because music is so good at containing things that can't otherwise easily be contained in the same space.
Du Bois speaks about the double consciousness of the Negro. And when we take a look at Black music in particular, if we like starting with the Negro spiritual, as most people would recognize, right? The spiritual really has a multiple consciousness. What we also have to recognize as well is that the ability for enslaved Africans to really talk about desire, to talk about their wants, their bodies, and those kinds of things are really locked away for them, because the West has these ideals of sacred and secular, these very big binary choices and categories. And that's not necessarily something that is innately indigenous, African, or ancient. And so though the technology is fairly limiting, that doesn't mean that the mind and the imagination is. So here we have an opportunity to sort of like lean in on what it's saying. I do something with one spiritual where I look at, Lord, how come me here?
Lord, how come me here? Lord, how come me here? Lord, how come
and I go from Lord How Come Me Here into The Message by Grandmaster Flash.
Push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying.
Don't push me because I'm close to the edge and I'm trying not to lose my head. It's the same thing. Lord is the most sacred thing in there.
Right.
But there ain't
It's
no
a little
freedom
less
here.
like a jungle, but the sentiment is still there.
It's the same, like there ain't no freedom here. They stole my children. They treat me so mean. Broken glass everywhere. Streets like it's the same thing. We're talking about the same things, right? And
Right.
so I just think that we have, a great opportunity. Whether the audience is going to catch it or not, we all have, as musicians and as human beings, the opportunity to unpack the notions that we've been given. And this program, I think, is going to be a big part of that.
More about the folks in the ensemble for Jubilee, a Juneteenth concert at Historic Deerfield happening next week, and we'll hear about Patrick Dailey having the opportunity to sing with his hero. You're listening to the Fabulous 413 on 88.5 NEPM.
NEPM's podcasts are funded by Armbrook Village, offering research-based arts, music, fitness, and lifelong learning programs at their assisted living and Alzheimer's care community in Westfield. armbrookvillage.com.
I am with Patrick Dailey and Tim Eriksen, two of the folks performing as part of the ensemble for Jubilee, a Juneteenth concert of early American New England music at Historic Deerfield on June 20th. Can we talk about some of the other folks that are going to be involved in your ensemble and the fact that they're playing period instruments?
The ensemble consists of Patrick, Benjamin Hunter, violinist, coming out from the West Coast, wonderful fiddler whose work intersects with a bunch of different kinds of things from early music to kind of folk music. Lauren Ludwig specializes in New England viol music. There's a whole tradition of viol consort music that he's basically uncovering. It's interesting in its own right and intersects with this the compositions of Sonny Freeman, the Connecticut composer. David McCormick is executive director of Early Music America, plays Baroque violin. And we have Clay Zeller Townsend, who's coming in, who plays a Baroque bassoon and a thing called a tenorune, which I have yet to see. It's an A415 tenor bassoon-like instrument. So for people who are sort of musical instrument nerds and just sort of like old stuff, it's got a kind of a steampunk appeal, as well as of course the musical and historical connections.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that on the list and I was just like fascinated. I'm like, wait a minute, is there also an altarune and a sopranorune? Because that would be amazing.
We'll find out. I don't know.
We can always build them if we want them to come.
Yeah. And we'll also be joined by some shape note singers, just community singers who will be lending their voices in 4-part harmony.
That's wonderful too. Bringing the community into basically a community concert, because it's not as if like Putnam wasn't part of the community here in Western Mass as well.
Well, and Patrick, you said something that really resonated with me, that you're not coming alone.
Whenever I enter a space, I bring things with me. I bring folks with me. As Maya Angelou said, I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. So that is my ancestors, folks whose names I know and whose names I don't know, like my great-grandmother, and my great-granddaddy, my Pearl and Daddy Fred Slocum, who raised my mother on their sharecroppers farm in West Tennessee, and my great-grandmother lived to be 102, so I knew her. My grandmother, who is still living, is 97 this fall, and is a fabulous soprano, can still sing high G's and A flat. But because of the opportunities and the things of that day, never got the opportunities to study and to do what I'm doing. So I bring her, even though she's still living, I still bring her spirit with me. The students that I teach and mentor here at Tennessee State and other institutions around the country and even globally, I bring all of those folks and want to make them proud and hope to be a good steward of the gifts that they give me. So, yeah.
Patrick Dailey, I know that you're coming up to perform with us and perform some of the local works of African-American composers here at this concert, but who are some of the composers that would have been contemporary with Putnam from your neck of the woods, proverbially?
So Putnam's a little bit earlier from most of the folks that he would be in contemporary with, but in particular, as a good Nashvilleian would do, we have to bring up the Fifth Jubilee singers. And so though he's a little bit earlier, I'm sure there actually is some relationship there, because even one thing that I've learned as I've been doing a lot of work around Black composers of all sorts, from the early composers into the 19th century, 20th century, et cetera, is that there's a big network. And it's so interesting to see the network, how it develops as musicians, as thought leaders, as creatives, as politicians, et cetera, as institution builders. A lot of this is coming through what they would have called the Negro colleges, as we know them now, historically Black colleges and universities. So there's a lot of that relationship. And so I can really think mostly of, although he wasn't African-American, you have George White, who put the Jubilee Singers together. But if it wasn't for his student, his assistant director, and arranger of these songs, Ella Shepherd Moore. So Ella Shepherd is really important in the early work of capturing this music. I'm also the founder of the Harry T. Burleigh Spirituals Festival. And so Burleigh, having family roots that go back to enslavement, having been in New York and in Pennsylvania, through that Northeast corridor, there's a lot of linkage that we could definitely trace to Putnam, because Burleigh is probably studying some of the same things that Putnam is studying, more than likely is coming across this music. Florence Price, of course, the namesake of our festival, having gone to New England Conservatory, I know that there's some ties that can be explored with Putnam, with these other figures that we're amplifying in this program. So that's really exciting for me to even like dig into now. Like a new layer is being unlocked.
I dream of like A5s and A6s. I'm a contralto. I go the other direction. Tim Eriksen, what piece are you most excited to perform on the 20th?
Well, I'm excited to hear the ones that I haven't heard yet, and that none of us have heard yet. These Sonny Freeman pieces I'm really excited about, and I'm excited, of course, about exploring some of these connections, some of which are unknown. I'm looking forward to singing a piece as a community with the ensemble and the local singers called Ode on Science, which was a key piece by a group of singers of Black and Indigenous ancestry from Hartford during the Civil War, who dressed up in costumes of their ancestors, Revolutionary War era people, some of whom emancipated themselves by taking the place of white New Englanders on the front lines of the Revolutionary War. And during the Civil War, they, 150 years before Hamilton, dressed in revolutionary garb, and they sang these late 18th century pieces, and apparently sang them really well, because they sang for like 1,000 people in Springfield, like right across the street from where the studio is, the old opera house. And so I'm interested in bringing that into this context. I think that'll be really cool.
It sounds awesome. Oh, that sounds so cool. Okay, one last question. Patrick Dailey, we can't let you leave without you telling us a little bit of what it was like to sing with Aretha Franklin. Because if you're going to put that in your bio and like just lay it out there, I mean, I feel like we got to ask what it was like for you to sing with the Queen of Soul.
That still remains one of the highlights of my young career. I always say Aretha Franklin is really the reason I started singing, in a sense. I started studying voice. Now, to be clear, I started studying voice because I wanted to go to Fisk University and be a Jubilee singer. And I didn't do that. I went to Morgan State, proud of that. Morgan State University. However, I heard the Jubilee Singers and I was like, I want to do that. And that's why I started studying voice. But the first sort of sound that I hear of really authentic, full-bodied singing with nuance and color, vitality, and diversity even, was Aretha Franklin. And so she's sort of the sound that I heard and I still sort of situate with great singing across the board. So this is the eve of President Obama's inauguration, the first inauguration. Everybody who's anybody is in DC in 2009. I just went to be a part of the choir. The director of that choir, Nolan Williams Jr., I've known him for many years, and I just went to be in the choir. And one night he said, he pulls myself and a couple other guys aside. He said, so, hey, Miss Franklin's not doing the finale, or at least she's not planning to do the finale. So we need to prep you guys. to do it. So the other guy started the first verse, and then it came into the second verse, and he said, "Okay, Patrick, try it." And I just said, "Okay, I'll do this." And they said, "Okay, this is great. You guys will do it." So I'm like, "Great, I'll have a Kennedy Center debut." I'm already really excited. Then all of a sudden, we're getting ready to go on stage to start the concert. Next thing he says, he pulls me aside. We're walking on stage. Like the choir is walking on stage in our robes. He pulls me aside. "Oh, Patrick, Miss Franklin has decided to do the finale." I was like, "Oh, okay, so I guess I won't be singing." He's like, "No, she's doing the first verse. You're doing the second."
Whoa.
So do everything that you did in rehearsal. Just do exactly that. I'll be with you. Okay, great. Go. So I have to go on stage, with my idol, like watching her. And I've been in dress rehearsal all day. She didn't do a dress rehearsal. Her band did the dress rehearsal. Everybody else did it. Her background singers are like, "Oh, sing, baby." Like they're like being really kind. Now I have to go on stage, and this is happening. She sings the whole concert. She's killing. I don't know. I mean, she was in the voice of voices. And this is, when we think about Aretha, we think about a lot of her prime, like being in the 60s and the 70s. And she was in that bag that night. I was like, "Oh, you are singing. She's about to eat me alive." So I get down there. Nolan Way indicates for me to come down with his finger. I go down. I stand in the back, kind of just waiting. She sings the first verse. And I'll never forget it because the paper reads, she has a music stand and it has first verse, Miss Franklin, and it has the first words to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Then it says second verse, Patrick Dailey. After she finishes the first verse, being the queen, she didn't have to read anything else. So she indicates to bring everybody in for all of us to sing glory, glory, hallelujah. The key changes up a half step. I come in with the second verse and she looks around like, "Huh?" "Oh, okay." And she says this in the mic.
Everybody. The beauty of the lilies. Christ was born across the sea with the glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us live to make men free. While God is marching
She says that, like, you can, like, everything I'm about to say, you can find the video on YouTube. Aretha Franklin, Battle Hymn of the Republic, Kennedy Center. You will see a young Patrick with barely any facial hair and hair on his head. Those things have switched, and you will see a young, bright-eyed, timid young man singing with arguably his greatest inspiration. I can't put that. It was one of the greatest moments I could have ever had, honestly. That Aretha Franklin, can't beat it. Like, it's the greatest joy, and to have done it on that night, a King Day celebration, the eve of President Obama's inauguration, I really don't have words.
Well, hopefully we can at least measure close to that. We're not trying to exceed that, but we're going to have a really good time at the Jubilee concert at the Historic Deerfield next week on June 20th. Tim Eriksen and Patrick Dailey, both part of the ensemble that is happening for that day. You can find tickets and information at Historic Deerfield's website and event page. Thank you to the both of you for joining me and talking about this really fascinating event.
Lovely to speak with you.
Of course.
Yes, thank you so much.
No problem. They were a delight. Do check out that video. It is adorable to see the two of them singing together. Really, everything he says totally happens. Friday on the Fabulous 413, we are headed to Franklin County to hang out with Charles Thompson, a chairmaker, and Sam French, who makes much larger things and also chairs. Two workers navigating the artisan landscape of the hill towns while black, and all of the nuances that entails. Plus, Juneteenth celebrations and summer series at Wistaria Hearst Museum in Holyoke with Executive Director Megan Saylor, and Reds of the Loire Valley for our latest Tina Turner Memorial Wine Thunderdome at Dare Bottle Shop and Provisions in Great Barrington. Yes, finally, we are getting a tasting at Double Dare. It is kind of the best. That shop is wicked cute. Thanks so much to our Fabulous 413 tech team making all of the magics happen. I'm Khalees Smith. We'll see you tomorrow on the Fabulous 413.